Hello, everyone, and welcome to the palatial home studios of Parkside Alliance Church in Lacombe, Alberta. My name is Pastor Kevin Hogan, and I want to thank you so much for joining us for one of these Sunday morning sermons that we make available each and every week on our social media pages. We welcome all interaction. We are continuing on in the sermon series about Mark in the Gospel of Mark. And we are still in Mark chapter 1, and we're looking at verses 29 to 31, a very simple story. And I want to read it for you now. It's Mark chapter 1, verse 29, just 3 verses. It says, "As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them." Now, that's just 3 verses, and it seems to be a very, very simple story. But when I read this story this week, it hit me that this is what I need to hear this week, this simple story with those very simple actions of Jesus. This is a story where there is no words of Jesus, there's just an action. And the context of the story is they just had the encounter in the synagogue where Jesus had spoken, and everybody said, "Who is this man who speaks with such authority? He speaks like no one we have ever heard." And then the story of the man with the impure spirit, calling the impure spirit, called out to Jesus, and Jesus cast out that impure spirit. And again, this recognition that when God sent Jesus, Jesus came with a different kind of authority than anyone who has ever lived, of course, because he was the Son of God, and that is magnified in this particular story. There is a very famous picture, and I'm actually going to put it up on the screen. I'm going to move over just a bit. I'm going to put it up on the screen right there. So there it is. It's from the Sistine Chapel, the great depiction of that Michelangelo does. And in particular, this picture is a part of the creation of Adam. And there's a picture of God, there's a picture of Adam, and then there's this picture that you're seeing is the picture of the hand of God and the hand of Adam. Now, there's lots that could be said, and again, it's not our job to interpret art to say on the same basis that we would interpret Scripture and hold it up. But I believe that this image is a beautiful, beautiful image, and it can mean a number of things. And one of the questions that people ask is, why aren't they fingers touching? And a couple reasons that I believe that I have discovered too by looking it up and reading different articles on it is the fact that we have to reach out for the free salvation offered by God. But then there's something else. There's something that happens between those 2 fingers. It's called the spark of creation. And the spark of creation. In this picture, we have a depiction of the actual moment that God created man. There's something different about man than all of the rest of creation. After God created man, as I've talked about this in the past, all of creation, he said, this was good, and the day, he created all this, and this was good, it says in Genesis 1. But when he created man, it says, and he said, this is very good. Of all of creation, it is humans that are invested with the spark of life. God breathed into Adam and he became alive. Of all creation, we're the ones that are created with a soul. In eternality, we're different. Jesus came to close the gap. We're going to talk more about it in a second. Here's what one person says. I thought this was brilliant. This idea in the picture is it's to show man's separation from God because of sin. It also was to show how humanity yearns to touch God. It shows how God created man to want to have a relationship with him. It shows how God is compassionate toward mankind and wants to reach out and touch us and to help us in any time of need. The Adam and God do not touch in this piece because it was actually a stroke of genius, because it shows so much by doing so little. And there really is the plan of salvation, and I'll remove that picture now, but the plan of salvation is, once the relationship with man was broken, God then set a plan in motion, and the culmination of the plan is Jesus. And that's the story that we hear in the Gospels. And these little stories that we come across in the Gospels are just so powerful, because they help us to understand just how much God did to close the gap between him and us, because sin created a huge gap, a gap that is impossible for us to cover. We can't get across the gap, but God could, and he did, by sending his son, Jesus, into the world. And Jesus is the one that closed the gap and made salvation possible for all of us. He did so in such a beautiful and incredible way. And this story is just an illustration of that. So here we have, again, the story. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John, so the two disciples that they've called, and then also Simon and Andrew, Simon Peter. And they went to the home of Simon and Andrew. Now here's where we know and find out that Peter was married. Simon Peter was married because obviously he had a mother-in-law. And in those days, your homes were, today our homes are single family homes. Like, that is kind of what it has become for us in Western, in Western culture, and especially in the part of the world that I live in, single family homes. And, even though we may be in an apartment building, but in that apartment building, it's still single family homes. In that culture, like many cultures in the world now, that culture was one where it was multi-generational. You had all kinds of people living in the homes. You had your parents, you had some, and this was a case where Simon's mother-in-law was there as well. And it says quite simply that she, the mother-in-law, and here I am going to resist the urge to tell mother-in-law jokes. You've all heard them, you all know them, and I'm not going to go there with any of them. All we know is that she was in bed with a fever, and that they told Jesus about her. So we have Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who is ill, sick. Now, we don't know how sick she was. We don't know how bad the fever was. We don't know if the fever would have passed in a few days. We don't know if this was a life-threatening fever. We don't know anything about it. All it says is that she had a fever. She was ill, and it was of great concern to the rest of the family that she was in bed and she was unable to be with everybody else. So then we have the last verse, verse 31, where it says, so he went to her and took her hand and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Jesus took her by the hand. Now, Jesus doesn't say anything here. And I always find it interesting that when Jesus healed people, and especially when he healed people, and he healed all kinds of people. He healed people of blindness. He healed people of leprosy. He healed people that were crippled from birth. He healed people who were sick. Whenever he healed people, I am so glad that in the gospel accounts of Jesus healing, that Jesus doesn't do the same thing every time. Sometimes Jesus speaks. Sometimes he does things like when he healed one blind man, he reached down and he spit into the ground and made some mud and put it on the man's eyes. And, everything is a little bit different. And this one is really interesting, because all it says is that he took her hand and helped her up. And I think in that image, we have the beauty and simplicity of Jesus' ministry, that he came to make a difference, that he demonstrated his power over everything in this world because he created the world. Along with God, he created the world. And he shows his power over even something like a fever, which might have been a simple illness that may have passed in a couple of more days, but he just reached down and held her hand and he helped her up. Now, this picture of Jesus reaching down his hand and helping her up. Now, in those days, the beds that we have are usually up off the ground a little bit, but in those days, most beds were right on the ground. And so Jesus had to bend way down in order to pick her up, to hold her hand and to pick her up. Now, that's an interesting image because it is actually repeated a couple times in Scripture, and especially in the Gospel of Mark. There's two other stories, and I'm just going to briefly allude to those stories. This is the first time. The second time where Jesus takes somebody by the hand is found in Mark chapter 5. And I won't go into the details of the context, but if you want to read it for yourself, I encourage you. This is Mark chapter 5, and the whole story goes from verse 21 all the way down to verse 43. So it's kind of a long story, but the upshot is that he has an encounter with a synagogue leader by the name of Jairus, who came up to Jesus and fell at his feet, and he said, and he pleaded earnestly with him. He says, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went to him, and as he's traveling with this large crowd towards Jairus's house, it says that there's all kinds of people coming up to her and up to Jesus, or they're with Jesus in the journey, and then a woman who had been bleeding for years, came up and touched the hem of Jesus' cloak. Jesus stopped. It says at once, this is verse 30, and once Jesus realized the power had gone out from him, he turned around and he says, "Who touched my clothes?" And everybody says, "There's tons of people here. How can you ask who touched me?" But Jesus looked around and he saw the woman. The woman was at his feet and trembling with fear. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, and you are freed from your suffering, and be freed from your suffering." And there's so much in that story. I don't have time to go into it today, but it was an amazing moment of incredible grace to a woman who would have been shunned and outcast by everyone because she lived as a ceremonially unclean person because she had a bleeding issue. She never stopped bleeding until Jesus helped her. Anyways, they finally get to the house of Jairus, and they came running out and they said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" And Jesus overheard what they said, and he said, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And he did not let anyone follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother and the brother of James. And when they came into the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw the commotion with the people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he asked them to leave. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and he went into where the child was. And I just want you to listen to this part. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old, and at all this, they were completely astonished. He just reached down and took her by the hand, and she came back to life. Amazing. There's another story of someone where Jesus reached out his hand, and this is a story that's found in Mark chapter 9. And again, I'd like to encourage you to read it if you can, found in verses 14 down to 29. Again, a little longer story. But the story begins with a conversation that Jesus has with a bunch of people, and then they brought him a child who was possessed by a spirit, an impure spirit, much like the story that we talked about last week. He says in verse 17, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth. He gnashes his teeth and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. And then Jesus says, "Oh, you unbelieving generation," ultimately saying, "Bring the boy to me." So they brought him, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around and foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the boy's father, can you imagine the pain that this father had? "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or the water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help him." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for everyone who believes." And immediately the father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." Again, I'm going to be talking about these stories later on in my sermon series, but I'm just alluding to them as an illustration today. So much more could be said about these statements. And Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene. He rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And the spirit shrieked and convulsed him violently and came out. And the boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. Those are just two other stories of Jesus reaching down, in both cases, all the way down to the ground, either to a bed or caught on the floor. He reached down, took the hand of the person that he was ministering to and lifted them up. That's the powerful part of this story. And if you're going to look at these three verses, and going back to Mark 1 and the story of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, it just simply says he went to her, took her hand, and he helped her up. That is such a huge picture of just how far Jesus had come to close the gap between God and us. Not only did he humble himself to become a human like us, come into the world the same way that we came into the world. Not only did he humble himself to go all the way to the cross, which is another story entirely, but Jesus humbled himself so that he could reach down to humanity, to the ones that he had created in the first place, and say, "I am here to save you. I'm here to welcome you back into a relationship with the one who made you in the first place. I am here to save you and welcome you to be part of God's family." And I will say this, marvelous things happen when we are held by the hand of Jesus. Because for every single one of us, when we came to know Christ, that's exactly what he did. He reached down to us. We reached up to him in faith and trusted him. We became part of his family. That's such a beautiful picture, and it's as simple but as powerful and wonderful and complex as it needs to be. God reached his hand down to us and gave us salvation. Now, if you're like me, you have had many experiences excuse me, over the years where you did not know if you were going to have the strength to get through it or to carry on. And I also know this, that there are seasons that we go through that in some ways are more difficult than others. And in my own personal life, and many of you know this, that we have had a lot in the year to 2024. And again, this week, another absolutely momentous occasion of earth-shattering change to our family and to our lives. And every step of the way, people say, how do you carry on? How do you move on from day to day? And I go, well, it's because I know that in the midst of this, God is with me. And I'm going to conclude with a really simple story. Came across this story, but I've seen this happen in my own life as well, because I've actually done this. Story is of a father and a little child, just a toddler, just learning how to walk, but able to walk. And they're walking down a path in the forest. And the little boy, the father reaches down, and the little boy reaches up and grabs the father's finger, and he's holding on for all his might. But then the little boy trips and falls to the ground. And the father is sort of distracted and he's not really paying attention. He's thinking about other things. The little boy gets up off the ground. Little ones, they don't have very far to fall, and they don't never hurt themselves because they're so little. Gets up, dusts himself off, reaches up, grabs his dad's finger again, and they carry along until the little boy trips again and falls down and picks himself up. This happens 3 or 4 times. And finally, the dad notices what's happening, and he says to the little boy, he says, "You keep falling down." And the little boy says, "Yes, Father, I do. Yes, Dad, I do. I keep falling down." But he said, "But I wouldn't fall down if you actually held my hand." So the father changed, and he reached down and he held his son's hand. And the rest of the journey was one where the little boy still stumbled, but he never fell to the ground because he was being held by his father's hand. And that's us. In this story, Jesus reached down and held her hand and helped her up. Jesus holds our hand and is with us every step of the journey, no matter how difficult it is. He's with us in the good times and the bad times. He is with us no matter what. He will never leave us nor forsake us. Our God is an amazing God. And the outstretched hand of God is there to hold us no matter what we go through. Till the next time we meet, may God bless you, and may you go being held in the hand of God. Amen.
This one, just give me Jesus.